All right, so today we're going to get into some uh, pretty fascinating stuff. We're looking at Hermann Kafka, Franz Kafka's father, through like the lens of the Enneagram, right?
Hmm.
And you've shared some sources with me that analyze him as a type 8, the challenger,
Right?
and even more specifically, the self-preservation subtype.
Yes.
Now, I know a little bit about the Enneagram, but like, how does this specific subtype, how does that actually play out in Herman's life? And like, what makes it so key to understanding him?
That's a great question. Yeah, so it's not enough to just say, oh, Herman was an 8, because like the self-preservation instinct, sometimes it's even called the satisfaction subtype.
Okay.
It adds a whole other dimension.
Hmm.
Because for these 8s, it's not just about power. It's more about securing resources, securing their immediate environment to make sure they survive. So it's almost primal.
Interesting. So it's less about, I guess, dominating others just for the sake of it,
Uh-huh.
more about like creating this bubble of security for themselves.
Okay.
Okay. So does that actually match up with what the sources say about Herman?
Absolutely. Yeah. So if you remember that anecdote from Letter to His Father, where Franz describes Herman enforcing rules with an iron fist
Mm.
and like shutting down any dissenting opinions,
Right.
that wasn't just a power trip. It was about maintaining order in his domain.
Mm.
So think of it like a king protecting his castle, but the castle is his entire world.
Okay. Yeah. That actually makes me think of The Trial, where Joseph K. is completely at the mercy of this confusing kind of arbitrary legal system.
Yeah.
It's like he's trapped in this world with all these rules he doesn't even understand, let alone like challenge.
Yeah.
Could that be Franz like projecting his experience with Herman's control, but onto a larger like societal scale?
I think that's a really insightful connection. Yeah, because it makes you wonder
Hmm.
if something like even the law, which is supposed to be like this fundamental, part of society, if even that becomes like this oppressive force in Kafka's work, is that just a reflection of how like suffocating Herman's control felt for Franz in his daily life?
Wow, so we're already seeing this link between Herman's personality and then like the themes that show up in Franz's writing. It's not just biographical detail. It's like the Enneagram is giving us like a code to kind of decipher these deeper anxieties that are at play.
Exactly.
But okay, so let's talk more about the self-reliance, right?
Yeah.
That seems like so central to the 8. How did that actually manifest in Herman beyond just being, a strict father?
Well, so the sources describe Herman as like incredibly self-sufficient,
Mm,
almost to a fault.
okay.
He refused to delegate. He like belittled Franz's attempts to help out in the family business, and just generally he was skeptical of like other people's competence.
Mm.
And this goes beyond just being hands-on, right?
Yeah.
It's like this deep distrust of anyone else's ability to get things done correctly.
Yeah. Wow. That's got to be tough to grow up with?
Yeah,
You're constantly being told, even if it's indirectly, like you're not good enough.
exactly.
But I'm also thinking about like Kafka's Metamorphosis, where Gregor Samsa wakes up as a bug, right?
Yeah.
He's completely reliant on his family, but they're repulsed by him. Is there like a connection there? Maybe this fear of vulnerability that Franz kind of picked up from Herman
Yeah.
and then like twisted into this horrifying scenario.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And it really gets to like the core of the self-preservation 8,
Hmm.
because they see needing others as weakness, so they build up this fortress of self-sufficiency, right?
Mm-hmm.
But what's interesting is it's like Herman seems to have projected that fear onto Franz, almost creating this like cycle of dependence and inadequacy.
Oh, okay. So we've got this controlling father figure who also instills a sense of like incompetence in his son.
Right.
Not exactly a healthy recipe for, emotional development.
Yeah.
But before we get too deep into the psychology here, I'm curious about like the emotional side of things.
Yeah.
Did Herman ever like let his guard down? Was there any softness to him?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. So self-preservation 8s, especially those who are like Herman, who were probably raised in like really harsh environments, they learn to equate vulnerability with danger.
Okay.
So they build up all these emotional walls and they project strength even when they're actually hurting.
So it's like a suit of armor, but made out of emotional detachment.
Exactly.
But I'm thinking about the castle again.
Yeah.
And how, like, Kay is desperately trying to connect with these figures in the castle, but they're completely inaccessible.
Right.
Is it, like, too simplistic to say that the castle is Herman and Kay is Franz? Forever trying to reach a father who's emotionally, like, locked away?
That's a really powerful reading, and
Mm.
I think it highlights something really crucial, which is that the castle isn't just physically imposing. It also represents this, like, emotional unavailability.
Mm.
That's incredibly frustrating.
Yeah, and it makes me wonder if Kafka's writing, with all its like confusing bureaucracy and, unattainable goals, is actually a reflection of trying to navigate a relationship with someone exactly like Herman.
Yeah.
Someone who's built these like impenetrable defenses, but
Yeah.
also maybe is like deeply afraid of being truly seen.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like Kafka took the blueprint of this relationship with Herman and built a whole world out of it. Like a world where connection is this constant struggle. And you brought up the castle earlier,
Yeah.
which I think is fascinating because even just like the way Kafka describes the castle evokes this feeling of Herman's personality.
Really? In what way?
Well, think about how, like, Kay describes the castle. It looms over the village, shrouded in mist, impossible to fully grasp.
Mm-hmm.
It's described as, like, massive, imposing, even, like, menacing at times. Does that sound familiar?
Yeah, it does. It's like those descriptions aren't just about architecture. They're about Herman himself.
Exactly.
This larger-than-life figure who kind of casts a shadow over everything.
Exactly. And remember how we talked about self-preservation eights, creating their own rules and systems to maintain control?
Right.
Well, the castle operates the same way. It's this labyrinth of, like, bureaucracy with officials who are just aloof and unreachable.
Right.
And they operate by this logic that Kay can never quite figure out.
Yeah. It's that classic, like, Kafka-esque feeling of being trapped in a system that you can't understand,
Right.
let alone control. But hold on, I'm thinking about that anecdote where Herman refused to even let Franz light his cigar.
Oh, yeah.
It wasn't enough to just be in charge. It had to be done his way, down to the smallest detail.
Yeah, that's a perfect example of how Herman's, like, eightness went beyond just wanting control. It was about dictating the terms of that control.
Right.
And in a way, isn't that what the castle's doing to Kay? It's not just that he can't get in. It's that the very process of trying to gain access is designed to, like, break him down,
Yeah.
to force him to conform to the castle's arbitrary rules.
Right. But isn't there also this sense of absurdity in Kafka's work? Like, even in the midst of all this despair, there's this kind of dark humor, this recognition of how ridiculous these situations are. Does that fit with, like, this reading of Herman as this, like, oppressive force?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it really gets at the complexity of, like, Franz's response to his father.
Mm.
Because on the one hand, he's clearly grappling with the pain and frustration of being under Herman's thumb, right? But then there's also this element of satire, almost like he's finding a way to reclaim some power by exposing the absurdity of it all.
So he's not just a victim of his father's personality. He's also using his art to kind of process it and understand it.
Exactly.
Maybe even to poke fun at it a little bit.
Exactly. Yeah, and it brings us back to, like, why this whole deep dive is so valuable, because we're not just, like, diagnosing Herman, right?
Right.
We're actually seeing how his personality ripples out, influencing Franz's worldview, his artistic choices,
Yeah.
his very way of seeing the world.
Yeah. Herman becomes this unintended collaborator in Kafka's writing,
Yeah.
even if it's like a collaboration born out of, conflict and struggle.
Yeah.
But before we get too carried away with, like, literary analysis here, I'm still kind of stuck on this idea of Herman's emotional unavailability.
Yeah.
The sources mention that he kind of just dismissed Franz's feelings as weaknesses,
Right.
which, from an eight perspective, makes sense.
Right. For self-preservation eights, emotions can feel like a threat to their carefully constructed sense of order.
Right.
They're messy, they're unpredictable, and they're potentially exposing. Right?
Yeah.
So it's much safer to just shut them down, both in themselves and in others.
So, but wouldn't that create this incredible sense of loneliness?
Yeah.
Like you're living in this fortress, but you're completely alone inside?
Absolutely. And, that's a theme that runs throughout a lot of Kafka's work, isn't it?
Yeah.
Characters who are isolated from each other, struggling to communicate, yearning for connection, but never quite able to achieve it.
Yeah, think about the metamorphosis. Gregor literally transforms into a creature that can't speak.
Right.
And his family, instead of trying to understand him, just kind of recoils in horror.
Exactly. It's like Franz took that experience of feeling emotionally alienated from his father
Yeah.
and, like, amplified it,
Yeah.
turning it into this grotesque but also deeply moving exploration of human isolation.
Okay. So we're seeing all these clear parallels between Herman's personality and then the themes that, like, permeate Kafka's writing.
Right.
The control, the self-reliance, the emotional detachment, they all find their way into his stories, albeit transformed and like distorted through the lens of his artistic vision, right?
Yeah. And, that's the power of art, isn't it? It takes these personal experiences, these deeply felt emotions, and it shapes them into something universal, something that resonates with other people
Right.
who might have completely different backgrounds, but can still relate to that feeling of being trapped, alienated, misunderstood.
But if Kafka is like reflecting these aspects of his father in his work, does that mean he's also like condemning him? Or is there a sense of empathy, even forgiveness, kind of woven into these stories?
That's a really interesting question. And I don't think there's like a simple answer because there's clearly anger and resentment in Kafka's writing.
Right.
But I think there's also this level of understanding, almost like he's trying to make sense of his father's behavior, to see the world through Herman's eyes.
So it's like he's saying, I don't condone what you did, but I can see how your personality, your experiences led you to this point.
Exactly. And, that's where the Enneagram can be so helpful,
Yeah.
right? Because it doesn't excuse behavior, but it does provide context.
Okay.
It allows us to see the underlying motivations, the fears and insecurities that drive people to act the way they do.
So instead of just judging Herman as like a tyrant, we can try to understand the forces that shaped him,
That's exactly.
the same way that like Franz seems to be doing in his writing. Okay. So we've talked about the castle as like a symbol of Herman's emotional fortress. We've explored the themes of isolation and absurdity in Kafka's work. We've even touched on the possibility of like empathy and understanding.
Yeah.
What else can we kind of glean from this Enneagram lens when it comes to like Kafka and his father?
Well, there's one aspect of like Herman's self-preservation 8 tendencies that we haven't fully explored yet.
Yeah.
And that's how it manifested in like his relationship with authority,
Okay.
both like societal norms and institutions.
Now that you mention it, the sources did point out how Herman seemed to just disregard social conventions when they like didn't suit him.
Right.
He prioritized efficiency over diplomacy, almost like he had his own like rule book.
Exactly. And remember how we talked about eights creating their own systems of control?
Right.
Well, it's not just about like personal relationships. It extends to how they interact with the world at large.
Okay.
And for Herman, it seems like rules were more like guidelines, bendable when it suited his needs.
That makes me think about like the baffling bureaucratic systems in Kafka's stories.
Right.
In the trial, Joseph K. is completely at the mercy of this legal process that just feels arbitrary and nonsensical. It's almost like a caricature of authority.
It's as though Friends took his experience of living under Herman's like idiosyncratic rule book
Right.
and just projected it onto these larger systems of power.
Mm-hmm.
And the result is this like chillingly absurd world where the rules are constantly shifting and individuals are left powerless and confused.
But there's also a sense of alienation within those systems too, right? Like
Yeah.
individuals are reduced to like cogs in a machine, stripped of their humanity.
Yeah,
Does that connect back to Herman in any way?
I think it absolutely does. Remember how Herman dismissed Franz's attempts to contribute? How he belittled his abilities?
Right.
That kind of behavior creates this profound sense of alienation.
Right.
This feeling of like not being seen or valued for who you are.
It's like you're constantly being judged and found wanting, never quite measuring up to the standards set by this like imposing figure.
Exactly.
And it makes me wonder if those like faceless bureaucracies in Kafka's stories are actually a representation of Herman's like emotional distance, that inability to truly connect on a personal level.
That's a brilliant insight.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it's not just about like physical control.
Right.
It's about this emotional disconnect that can be just as suffocating. And I think that's something a lot of us can relate to, even if we haven't had a father like Herman.
Right.
We've all encountered systems or individuals who make us feel unseen, unheard, undervalued.
It's that universal feeling of being like lost in a maze,
Yeah.
banging your head against the wall, trying to find a way out. And Kafka captures that feeling so perfectly in his writing.
He does, yeah. And that brings us back to like the power of understanding personality types, like the Enneagram. It's not about labeling people or excusing your behavior.
Right.
It's about gaining a deeper understanding of the forces that shape us, both internally and externally.
Right. It's about recognizing those patterns, those like ingrained ways of thinking and behaving that can sometimes lead to conflict, misunderstanding, even pain.
Yeah.
But it's also about like finding ways to navigate those challenges with more empathy and awareness.
Exactly. And maybe even finding a bit of humor in the absurdity of it all, just like Kafka did.
Yeah.
After all, life is full of contradictions, complexities, and unexpected twists and turns.
Yeah, and that's what makes it so fascinating to explore, right?
Yeah.
Whether we're delving into the depths of human personality or getting lost in the pages of a Kafka novel, it's all about like expanding our understanding of ourselves and the world around us.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive.
But before we do, I have to ask, if we could like sit down with Hermann Kafka today, knowing what we know about the Enneagram and his impact on France,
Hmm.
what would you say to him?
That's a thought-provoking question.
Hmm.
I think I would start by acknowledging, the challenges he faced, like the
Yeah.
harsh environment he likely grew up in,
Yeah.
and how that might have shaped his need for, like, control and self-reliance.
And then,
Then, I would gently encourage him to reflect on the impact of his behavior on those around him, especially Franz.
okay,
Not to, like, place blame,
right.
but just to open up a dialogue, to explore the possibility of, like, a different way of relating to others.
That's a powerful message, and I think it speaks to the heart of what we've been exploring in this whole deep dive. It's about recognizing the humanity in everyone,
Yeah.
even those who might seem, intimidating or difficult to understand.
Yeah. It's about finding compassion, even amidst the complexities and contradictions of human behavior.
Beautifully said. Well, listeners, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've explored the Enneagram, analyzed the complex personality of Hermann Kafka,
Mhm.
delved into the depths of Franz Kafka's writing, and even like pondered some pretty profound questions about human nature.
I hope this deep dive has given you some food for thought, some new insights into yourself and the people in your life.
And maybe even inspired you to pick up a Kafka novel or two.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep into the fascinating world around us.
Happy reading, everyone.